who was Jesus of Nazareth? And if he was the Son of God, then how does divine incarnation work? How does the divine nature subsist alongside a human nature? Was Jesus omniscient? It seems from several passages that he was capable of being surprised. So it might have been that he was playing along with the mortal condition there. Who knows? In any case, did Jesus pay the debt of our sin with his sacrifice on the cross? And if so, what conditions do we have to fulfill to receive that absolution? How does divine forgiveness operate? These are important questions if there's any chance that Christianity is true. It has to do with the fate of our soul, the nature of the world in a fundamental sense. So it makes sense that Christians often have very strong convictions about their answers to these and related questions. Sects have arisen and fragmented on the basis of different possible answers to these questions. So I don't want to offend anyone with my own beliefs about these questions, but I do get asked, how can you call yourself a Christian if you believe in reincarnation or you believe in karma or these different Hindu concepts and things like that? And it's a reasonable question. I mean, for most people, Christianity is one of these major denominations. It is Eastern Orthodoxy, it is Catholicism, it is, this Protestant sect, or it is just the Bible, something like that. I've heard the arguments that are out there regarding why we should adopt wholesale all of the positions from Eastern Orthodoxy or all of the positions from Catholicism or every literal statement from the Bible. I don't buy any of those arguments. And so it's not that I've tried to stick to some unique special snowflake position. I don't want to get along. It's just that I won't believe something if I don't believe it. I have to be persuaded that something is true. And for my part, I've always placed truth ahead of Christianity. I was a Christian on and off during my upbringing, and I spent a few years in my early adulthood as an atheist. I came back to Christianity because I came to believe that it was true. I didn't start from Christianity and then try to make it true with all of the arguments that I could grab. No, I've built up gradually a worldview by assimilating what seems to make sense from science, what seems to make sense from the philosophical positions that I've heard and thought about myself, and I just try to do my best to find out what's true about the world. I think that's kind of the boat that all of us are in. For some people, adopting wholesale an existing position is a lot more comfortable. I think epistemologically, it is difficult to defend, right? I won't just take assertions. When the Catholic Church has all of its various dogmas, very rarely are they justified from first principles with natural theology. Usually they're just assertions. And many of them are beneficial. And it's good for individuals when they believe these things. But if you are of a philosophical temperament and you can't help but critically evaluate all of the positions that you hear, and you care about the truth, then you're going to have to think for yourself on all of these issues and not just adopt a position because the majority adopt it. That is an appeal to the masses. That is a logical fallacy. I don't think Christianity is any of the major denominations simply because they are large and other sects are small. When it comes to the question of Christology, in my opinion, the way that I've been able to make sense of it is in terms of the Hindu concept of the avatar and the Neoplatonic concept of the hierarchy of souls. Okay? So, a while ago, I was an atheist and materialist, and then I started teasing out implications, entailments of various positions within physics, mainly, that I had adopted. And I realized, as a consequence of the many worlds interpretation, Bostrom's simulation argument, the quantum immortality thought experiment, that very likely some form of idealism was true, as well as the immortality of the soul. I kept on teasing out implications, and I came to realize that many of these entailments are shared in common with traditional beliefs in Hinduism. And so I started looking into Hinduism. I was basically a practicing Hindu for a time. You can't really be a Hindu as a non-Indian, but I went to the Vedanta Center in Hollywood, and I spoke with the monks regularly. I asked them a lot of questions. I tried very hard to understand their philosophical system, Advaita Vedanta. I still mainly agree with it. There are only a couple things that I disagree with them on. And why I'm a Christian is one of those issues that they don't believe and I do. But anyway, that's the way I've come into my position. I came into Christianity because of the argument that I'm going to outline here. There are other reasons as well, kind of psychologically, mythologically, symbolically, but the kind of nuts and bolts of Jesus's sacrifice for us is what I'm interested in this faith. So anyway, the concept of the avatar makes sense to me in that there is a spectrum of more or less perfect natures, more or less perfect souls. Some souls are very bad with their perception of reality. They are sinful in their conduct, they're untruthful in their beliefs, and other souls have very accurate perceptions of reality at different levels. Now, if reality is infinite, then this spectrum is either infinite or it approaches an asymptote, at which point there's basically an isomorphism between the nature of the soul and the nature of reality. There is a given soul, a particular soul, which is the most perfect embodiment of the nature of things. So that is similar to the concept of the avatar. The reason in Hinduism why we deviate from the way, from the Dharma, is that we have our karma. We have our attachments based on our conduct in the past. Now, if a soul didn't have any karma, there would be no reason for it to deviate from the nature of things, from the Dharma. So, a being with no karmic debt is at least possible within that philosophical worldview. In Neoplatonism, you have the idea that each level of being begins with a monad, which is the most perfect and most simple exemplar of that species of being, and then that descends into a multiplicity. So souls have the most perfect soul, the kind of archetype of soul itself, and then all of the manifold souls that descend from that one. That makes sense to me. Okay, so the idea of an incarnation is the idea that somehow that perfect soul, or that avatar, adopts a human body. Now, would that human body be omniscient? Would it be unequivocally that perfect soul, or be unequivocally that avatar? For me, that doesn't quite make sense, because there are innumerable lives that an avatar could lead and have that same nature. So it's not that the totality of the being of that perfect soul is subsumed within the limits of this human life, but nothing in that human life deviates in any way from the nature of that perfect soul. Okay? Now, how does that being sacrifice himself for us and pay our karmic debt? This is what the Advaita Vedantists say cannot happen. I was there at the Vedanta Center, and some lady who might have been a Christian asked about this idea of, forgiveness. Is there no possibility of forgiveness in your system? And basically, they just doubled down and said, no. If you have karmic entanglements, you have to work them out through karma yoga, right? Through different forms of discipline until you return your soul to a kind of stillness and you can kind of identify with the greater reality once again. It's just the way of things. You have to pay your karma yourself. I realized that it is an implication of my theory of time that there actually is a way of bridging the gap between a being with a karmically entangled past and a being with no karmically entangled past. Because for me, time is not perfectly linear. It branches as you go back and as you go forward. There are modern physics accounts that make sense of this. So, since the past is not fixed ultimately, if you gradually improved your nature and tried to follow the law, right, the logos, more perfectly as time went on, if you stayed in that state for a long enough period of time, there would be no trace in the pasts that you're entangled with of your prior karmic entanglements. Right? There is a way of getting to that state being free of sin. Now, getting to that state is difficult, especially in our world, the way things are today. It seems like things conspire to keep us entangled in matter. The prevailing cults are basically cults of the apotheosis of matter. AI, is the future of life, or transhumanism, escaping the limitations of our nature and, having unbounded access to technologies that'll augment our experiences. The world is the place where we are all saved, and it is through the nature of material things and mechanisms that, we can hope for something greater. And in a climate like this, how can you remain pure? How can you improve yourself with the obligations of work? People in developed countries work more often than their ancestors did, more hours than their serf ancestors did, and in way overstimulated environments. If it was ever possible to achieve a state of samadhi, nirvana, whatever, in the past, it's probably not possible now just because there's too much noise, there's too much going on, perceptually and also psychically. The psychic disturbances that are out there, the engineered mass psychosis that exists in so many places, would seem to interfere with this kind of natural state of mind that we're looking for. It also makes sense that there would be some worlds that descend past a point of no return, where that world can't just pull itself up by its bootstraps, but has to be redeemed by a being of a higher nature that is not from or of that world. And that's the way the avatar concept operates in Hinduism. The avatar comes cyclically, but specifically when the world needs him, he comes. So I came to believe that. And when I looked at the historical record, you could believe in the historical reality of Krishna, but for me, Krishna being an incarnation of God is not mutually exclusive with Jesus being an incarnation of God. However, there is more evidence of the historical Jesus, and there is the idea of a return at the end of history. So for me, this maps onto the timeline of history that we're dealing with, combating transhumanism, the rise of AI. How do we have a salvation of this world, given everything that's going wrong with it, you would need a higher being to literally just kind of run things, at least for a while. And that's what the Bible promises. So in that way, historically, the case seems plausible to me. Now, Jesus paying the debt of our sin is a very un-Hindu kind of idea. Like I said, that's what I disagree with in their position. So how could the Avatar take on our karmic debt? How could that suffering that he endures pay for our sin? I already said there is a way of eliminating that past, that karmic entanglement, by maintaining this kind of state of purity for a long enough period of time. And I think that's what Christ is here to do. He is here to assimilate us to his nature. He tells us that we can do the miracles that he does and greater. He sets out to save souls. He tells us to act in the same way to save souls. Even in the book of Revelation, when it talks about what heaven is like, you learn from Christ in heaven. So it is continually learning more the nature of truth, the nature of reality, assimilating yourself to the nature of reality, becoming more Christ-like, until eventually you reach a point where there is no distinction between you and Christ. And then you take up that salvific role yourself. And how is your karmic debt ultimately paid? Well, Christ's sacrifice becomes your sacrifice. Take up your cross. That's the way I see it. And it's a universal enough reading of the symbols that it could be true regardless of what universe you were born in, right? Some parallel universe might not have a historical Jesus or a historical Nazareth or, Israel or any of these concepts or places. But the possibility of the incarnation of the most perfect soul, his opportune appearance when the world needs him, his regulating of temporal affairs to guide souls more and more closely to his nature, to assimilate to his nature, to then go out and save as many other worlds as are possible. That's a concept that I don't see a problem with in my worldview overall. I can make sense of that. It tells me why Jesus came. It tells me what he wants us to do, what the point of it is. It makes sense of the sacrifice that he made for us. So, I'm sure it won't convince everybody. I'm sure that many people would rather stick with their historical narratives and historical answers to these questions. This is what I really believe. This is why I'm a Christian and not just a Hindu. I think Christianity is more true than Hinduism because the historical reality of Jesus and his mission and his second coming is something that this world is entangled in, no matter what. You can deny Christianity, but the world that we're moving into looks a lot like the prophecies of the end times from the Bible. So it seems to be a historical thing. It fits with this kind of universalistic Hindu or Neoplatonic conception of the perfect soul, how we might be saved. One thing that a lot of people worry about when it comes to Christianity is the fact that Jesus was a Jew, and the Jews claim to be God's one and only chosen people. A lot of people don't like that idea. They don't think God would play favorites like that. And if God was going to play favorites, there were more noble peoples and more noble individuals, when God chose Abraham than Abraham himself. Sure, he obeyed God, but was he really a stand-up guy? According to what Jesus tells us to do, Jesus says not to be obsessed with material things, to hate the world, to be celibate if at all possible. That's what Jesus tells us to do. And yet Abraham was a polygamist. He followed God because God promised him the multiplication of nations from his progeny. Very carnal things, right? Elsewhere on the planet at that time, there were already ascetics. There were people who were trying to live like the purest possible life and understand the nature of reality for themselves. I don't know that Abraham was like the best of all men living at that time. It just doesn't add up. I don't think the historical nation of Israel was the most exemplary nation. I mean, maybe the Scythians were like a more moral people in a lot of ways. Maybe the Greeks were a more moral people on average than the Hebrews. But why would God use Israel? Why would God use that community? Because there's also Satan, right? Why does Jesus call Israel, the Pharisees, the synagogue of Satan? Because Satan will act in a world to try to acquire dominion of it. Just like there is the most perfect soul, there is also the kind of opposite, most manifold agglomeration or conglomeration of karmic entanglements that kind of functions as a larger overall organism. In my opinion, Satan can't be one unitary soul, but he can be a kind of mass that constellates into a singular will to power, to domination. And I think that this force acts into history, and it co-opts individuals who make contact with this being. I think Israel in various ways has made contact with that being, and especially if you look into like Sabbatai Zevi and Frankism and some of the conduct of esoteric Judaism lately, a lot of it's extremely satanic. Not that they're the only Satanists, there are other Satanists out there. But it makes sense that a people with the hubris to think that they are God's one and only chosen people, who rejected their Messiah when he came, who were called the synagogue of Satan, they have an instrumental role to play in history, and they are playing that role. Satan is involved in what they're doing. God and his providence is also involved in what they're doing. Why was Jesus a Jew? Why did he appear among those people? Because the fate of Israel is key to the fate of the world. Whether you like it or not, you have to look at that as just the empirical facts. And in some other world, it might not be Israel, but it would be some nation who had a similar idea, similarly selfish as a nation, similarly acquisitive, whatever. Not to paint with a broad brush and say all Jews today are like this. No, a lot of my best friends throughout my life have been Jewish. I like Jews as people very often. And it's dangerous, I know, to like make these broad generalizations, but it's a theological issue, and so I think it's important. What is the fate of Israel as a spiritual entity? Judaism as a religion? Why does Jesus come out of that if he is this incarnation of the perfect soul, if he has much loftier ambitions than what is talked about in the Old Testament as their concept of their Messiah, right? That's one piece of evidence that God's providence doesn't always tell us exactly what's going on. He does what he has to do. He does what we need him to do for us. But he doesn't necessarily explain it. The Jews were surprised by the nature of the Messiah. That's why many of them rejected it. But that community, Israel, has a role to play in history. And by sending his incarnation into that community, he opens up world-transforming possibilities in ways that probably would not have happened if Jesus was born a Hindu or something like that. So that's basically it. Let me know what you think about these arguments. It's what I really believe. I didn't and couldn't in this format explain all of the justifications for these ideas, But hopefully, if you've watched some of my other content, this more or less made sense. You understand why I'm a Christian and not a Hindu or just a perennialist. You know, I don't just adopt the kind of pretense of Christianity as an exoteric garb of this more esoteric doctrine. No, I think the literal historical narrative is true. The gospel message is true. Jesus did pay our debt. We can follow him to heaven. There will be a second coming, and that will resolve many of these issues in history. So anyway, if you have questions, ask them in the comments, your own thoughts on these matters. I'd love to hear them. Thank you guys for listening. Also, let me know what you think about the studio. I'm setting this up for the Plato channel, so I don't know if this is exactly the way I will do it. I might have to get some more lighting. Not sure about that. So let me know about that. Thank you guys for listening. God bless.